The weak morning light filtered through the gaps in the blinds, painting stripes across the worn linoleum floor of their small apartment. Linda Stewart, all of 10 years old, carefully folded a slightly bruised apple into a brown paper bag. The aroma of stale coffee clung to the air, a familiar comfort in the cramped space. She watched her mother, Carol, smooth down her waitress uniform, a tired but resolute expression on her face. Linda's stomach twisted with a familiar nod of anxiety. The music appreciation program at school loomed over her like a dark cloud. "Don't forget your permission slip for the music program, sweetheart," Carol said, her voice soft despite the weariness etched around her eyes. She placed a worn piece of paper beside Linda's lunch. Linda stared at the slip, the words ELE Music Appreciation Program, instrument demonstrations, blurring into a mocking taunt. A wave of heat flushed her cheeks. She knew the other kids, the Jessica Morrisons and Tommy Richards of her class, would have gleaming violins and polished flutes. What would she have? Empty hands and a hollow ache in her chest. "Mama," Linda began, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if they asked me to play something?" The thought sent a shiver down her spine. She'd never even touched a real instrument, only the battered recorder they used in music class, its plastic body chipped and its notes flat and lifeless. The shame burned within her, a stark reminder of the chasm that separated her from her classmates, a chasm carved by money and opportunity. She imagined their sneers, their whispers, the way they always seemed to look at her, their eyes like polished stones, cold and unyielding. Carol knelt beside her, her hand warm against Linda's cheek. Linda closed her eyes, inhaling the faint scent of her mother's cheap perfume, a scent that spoke of long shifts and sacrifices. "You know what, baby girl?" Carol's voice was a soothing balm against Linda's rising panic. "Sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the heart, not from fancy instruments or expensive lessons." Linda opened her eyes, her gaze meeting her mother's. She searched her mother's face, seeking a hint of falsehood, a glimmer of doubt. But there was none, only a quiet strength, a fierce belief in something Linda couldn't quite grasp. Was it belief in her? Linda wanted to believe, to cling to her mother's words like a lifeline, but doubt gnawed at the edges of her hope. Her classmates wouldn't understand. They lived in a world of polished mahogany pianos and private tutors, a world where music flowed from expensive instruments like water from a gilded tap. What could she, a girl who'd never even held a real violin, possibly offer? The bus ride to school was a blur of anxious anticipation. Linda sat near the back, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the grimy window. The cityscape whizzed by, a tapestry of brick and steel, a stark contrast to the leafy suburbs where her wealthier classmates lived. Their houses, she imagined, were filled with the melodies of perfectly tuned instruments, the air thick with the scent of success and privilege. The weight of her poverty pressed down on her, a suffocating blanket of inadequacy. The music appreciation program was held in the school auditorium, a vast, echoing space that seemed to amplify Linda's anxieties. The stage, bathed in warm light, beckoned and terrified her in equal measure. Jessica and Tommy, seated a few rows ahead, snickered and whispered, their words sharp needles pricking at Linda's already raw nerves. She shrunk back in her seat, wishing she could disappear, melt into the worn velvet upholstery. Mrs. Patterson, her fourth-grade teacher, noticed Linda's distress. She offered a kind smile, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Don't worry, Linda," she whispered, her voice a gentle reassurance in the cacophony of excited chatter. "Just enjoy the music." But enjoyment felt impossible. Each demonstration, each perfectly executed note, was a painful reminder of her own lack of experience. She watched, mesmerized and envious, as her classmates showcased their talents, their fingers dancing across the keys of polished pianos, their breath weaving magic through gleaming flutes. Each performance was a testament to the opportunities she'd been denied, the world of music that remained tantalizingly out of reach. Then, The unexpected happened. Mr. Harrison, the high school orchestra director, announced a brief intermission, inviting any student who wished to try an instrument to come on stage. Linda froze, her heart pounding against her ribs. She saw Jessica and Tommy exchange a knowing glance, a cruel smirk playing on their lips. She knew what was coming. They nudged her forward, their whispers laced with mock encouragement. "Go on, Linda," Jessica hissed. "Show us what you can do." Linda hesitated, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Humiliation warred with a strange, unfamiliar flicker of defiance. She looked at Mrs. Patterson, who offered a small, encouraging nod. Something in her teacher's gaze, a quiet strength, a silent understanding, gave Linda a surge of unexpected courage. She stood up, her legs trembling, and walked towards the stage, the weight of her classmates' expectations, their silent mockery, heavy on her shoulders. The violin lay on a stand, its polished wood gleaming under the stage lights. Linda picked it up, her fingers clumsy and unsure. It felt foreign, heavy, a symbol of a world she didn't belong to. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and began to play. The melody that poured forth was raw, untamed, unlike anything the audience had heard that day. It wasn't technically perfect, the notes weren't always precise, but it was filled with a depth of emotion, a raw vulnerability that resonated with everyone in the auditorium. The music spoke of hardship, of resilience, of a quiet strength forged in the face of adversity. It was the music of her life, the melody of her heart. The auditorium fell silent, the whispers and snickers replaced by a stunned hush. Tears streamed down Mrs. Patterson's face. Jessica and Tommy stared, their mouths agape, their expressions a mixture of awe and disbelief. Mr. Harrison watched, his eyes wide with wonder, recognizing the spark of something truly exceptional. When the last note faded, a collective gasp rippled through the audience, followed by a thunderous applause. Linda stood on the stage, the violin still clutched in her hand, her heart pounding, her cheeks flushed, not with shame, but with a strange, unfamiliar sense of pride. Mr. Harrison approached her, his face beaming. "Linda," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "that was extraordinary. Have you had lessons before?" Linda shook her head, her voice caught in her throat. "Then it's even more remarkable," Mr. Harrison continued, his eyes shining with admiration. "I'd like to offer you a full scholarship for music lessons, and I want you in the youth orchestra." Linda stared at him, unable to speak. The world around her seemed to blur, the whispers and laughter of her classmates fading into a distant hum. All she could hear was the echo of the music, the melody of her heart, a song that had finally found its voice. The chipped paint of Mrs. Rodriguez's porch swing creaked a familiar rhythm, a counterpoint to the rhythmic clang of Mr. O'Malley's hammer from 2 houses down. Linda hugged her worn violin case close, its battered surface a reflection of her own circumstances. The scent of frying bacon, tinged with the sweetness of Mrs. Rodriguez's morning glories, hung heavy in the air, a comforting tapestry woven into the fabric of Sycamore Street. She inhaled deeply, the familiar aroma a small anchor in the swirling sea of her anxieties. These smells, these sounds, this street, they were normal. They were home, a place where chipped paint and worn-out shoes weren't signs of failure, but badges of shared experience. Yet, even within this haven, a quiet unease gnawed at her. School loomed, a starkly different world where worn shoes and hand-me-down clothes were not badges, but brands. Her fingers traced the outline of a small crack on the violin case, a silent conversation with the instrument nestled within. It was her mother's, a relic from a time before life had chipped away at their dreams, leaving behind only the bare necessities. Linda knew the violin represented more than just music. It was a symbol of a past life, a life where her mother had dared to hope for something more. Now, it was Linda's turn to carry that hope, a weight both exhilarating and terrifying. Today, the violin was more than just an instrument. It was her shield, her voice, and perhaps her folly. The thought sent a shiver down her spine, a premonition of the vulnerability she was about to expose. A robin perched on a telephone wire, its cheerful melody a stark contrast to the turmoil within her. She envied the bird its freedom, its apparent lack of worry. Did it ever feel the sting of Jessica Morrison's condescending gaze or the weight of Tommy Richards' mocking laughter? Did it understand the gnawing fear of being different, of being less? Linda doubted it. She kicked a loose pebble down the sidewalk, watching its erratic trajectory. It mirrored her own uncertain path, bouncing between the familiar comfort of Sycamore Street and the daunting precipice of Jefferson Elementary. The school building materialized at the end of the street, a brick-and-mortar monolith casting a long shadow over her thoughts. Its imposing presence seemed to amplify her anxieties, turning the quiet flutter in her stomach into a frantic hummingbird's wings. Each step towards the school felt heavier than the last, as if she were wading through thick mud, the pull of her apprehension anchoring her to the ground. The closer she got, the more the comforting smells of Sycamore Street faded, replaced by the sterile scent of disinfectant and chalk dust, a scent that always seemed to cling to the undercurrent of whispered judgments and unspoken hierarchies. She watched as other students arrived, their laughter echoing off the brick walls, their clothes crisp and new, their hair perfectly styled. They moved with an effortless confidence that Linda could only dream of, their conversations peppered with references to weekend trips and expensive gadgets, a language she barely understood. Each word, each gesture, served as a stark reminder of the chasm that separated her from them, a chasm not just of money, but of experience of belonging. She clutched the violin case tighter, its familiar weight a small comfort in this alien landscape. It was her only connection to something beyond the confines of this place, a secret world where her fingers could weave melodies that spoke a language everyone understood. But would they listen? Would they hear the music or just see the worn case, the hand-me-down clothes, the girl who didn't belong? The question lingered, unanswered, a heavy cloud shadowing the fragile hope that flickered within her. The school doors loomed, a gateway to an unknown future, a stage where she would either find her voice or be swallowed whole by the silent judgment of the crowd. And in the hollow chamber of her heart, a single, desperate prayer echoed. Let them hear the music. Let them see beyond the cracks. Let them just once see her. The afternoon sun cast long, hazy shadows across the worn wooden floor of the Jefferson Elementary music room, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Linda Stewart sat quietly in the back row, clutching her worn copy of Little Women, more for comfort than for reading. The room buzzed with the excited chatter of her classmates, their voices echoing off the high ceiling, a symphony of youthful exuberance that only amplified her own quiet anxiety. She watched as Jessica Morrison, her blonde hair perfectly curled, bragged about the new flute she was getting for Christmas, demonstrating imaginary finger movements with an air of practiced elegance. Tommy Richards, never one to be outdone, countered with tales of his 2 years of violin lessons, casually mentioning the prestigious music academy he attended. Each word, each boast, landed like a small stone, adding weight to the invisible wall that separated Linda from the world of privilege and opportunity. 2 years, she thought, tracing the outline of a faded flower on the cover of her book. 2 years of music lessons sounded like a lifetime. A lifetime she couldn't even imagine. Her own world revolved around the chipped formica table in their tiny kitchen, the smell of stale coffee and her mother's tired sighs. Music lessons, new instruments, these were luxuries beyond her grasp, dreams woven from the gossamer threads of other people's lives. She glanced around the room, her gaze lingering on the gleaming instruments displayed on the stage. A cello, its polished wood glowing warmly under the sunlight. A grand piano with its keyboard like a row of ivory teeth. A violin, its slender neck curving gracefully. They seemed to hum with a silent energy, a promise of melodies waiting to be unleashed. A strange yearning tugged at her heart, a mixture of longing and a vague, undefined fear. She had never touched an instrument, never dared to dream, of creating such beautiful sounds. It was a world reserved for children like Jessica and Tommy, children who lived in big houses with manicured lawns and overflowing toy chests. Mr. Harrison, the high school orchestra director, strode onto the stage, his presence commanding immediate attention. He smiled warmly, his eyes twinkling with an enthusiasm that was infectious. "Music," he began, his voice resonating through the room, "is a universal language." Linda felt a shiver run down her spine. A universal language. A language she desperately wished she could speak. Mr. Harrison picked up a violin, the same one that had captivated her attention earlier. He tucked it under his chin, the bow poised delicately over the strings. The first notes he played were tentative, almost hesitant, like a whispered secret. Then, as the melody unfolded, the music swelled, filling the room with a rich, vibrant tapestry of sound. Linda held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. The music seemed to wash over her, cleansing her of her anxieties, her insecurities, her fears. In that moment, she wasn't just a poor girl from the wrong side of town. She was part of something bigger, something beautiful, something universal. The music ended, and the room erupted in applause. Linda clapped along, her hands numb, her mind still lost in the echo of the melody. Mr. Harrison lowered the violin, a gentle smile playing on his lips. "Now," he announced, "who wants to try?" A flurry of hands shot up, eager voices clamoring for a chance to touch the instruments. Jessica and Tommy were at the front of the line, their faces alight with anticipation. Linda remained seated, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She longed to join them, to feel the smooth wood of the violin against her skin, to draw the bow across the strings and create her own music. But the fear of ridicule, the certainty of failure, held her captive. Linda, Mrs. Patterson, her fourth-grade teacher, approached her, her voice soft and encouraging. "Why don't you give it a try?" Linda's cheeks flushed. She shook her head, her heart sinking as Jessica's shrill laughter echoed through the room. "She doesn't even take music lessons," Jessica sneered, her words dripping with condescension. Tommy joined in, his laughter echoing Jessica's cruelty. "She probably doesn't even know how to hold it." The laughter rippled through the room, a wave of mockery washing over Linda. Her eyes stung with unshed tears, her throat constricting with shame. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the worn wooden floor and become invisible. Mrs. Patterson placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Go on, Linda," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the din. "Don't let them stop you." Linda hesitated, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Shame warred with a strange, insistent pull towards the stage, towards the waiting violin. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and stood up. As she walked towards the stage, she felt the weight of every gaze, every whisper, every unspoken judgment. It was a gauntlet she had to run, a test of her courage, a battle fought not with words, but with the silent language of her own yearning. Mr. Harrison handed her the violin, his eyes filled with a kind encouragement that warmed her chilled heart. She took the instrument gingerly, her fingers trembling as she touched the smooth wood. It felt strangely familiar, as if it had been waiting for her. She tucked it under her chin, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The bow felt awkward in her hand, heavy and unfamiliar. She closed her eyes, blocking out the curious stares, the mocking whispers, the weight of their expectations. In the silence behind her closed lids, she heard the echo of Mr. Harrison's playing, the soaring melody that had touched her soul. She remembered the yearning, the longing, the unspoken language that resonated deep within her. She took a deep breath and drew the bow across the strings. The first note that emerged was hesitant, shaky, a fragile whisper of sound. But then, as if guided by an unseen force, her fingers began to move, the bow gliding across the strings with a newfound confidence. The music that flowed from the violin was raw, untamed, a torrent of emotion that poured out of her like a flood. It was a song of longing, of hope, of pain, a melody woven from the fabric of her young life, a language she hadn't known she possessed. The room fell silent. The mocking laughter ceased. The whispers died away. All eyes were on Linda, her small frame illuminated by the afternoon sun, her face a mask of intense concentration as she poured her heart and soul into the music. Tears streamed down her cheeks, mingling with the melody, adding another layer of depth to the raw emotion of her performance. Jessica and Tommy stared in disbelief, their mouths agape, their expressions mirroring the astonishment that rippled through the room. Mrs. Patterson's eyes glistened with tears, her hand pressed to her heart, and Mr. Harrison, his face alight with wonder, watched Linda with a mixture of awe and something akin to reverence. He recognized, in that moment, the spark of something extraordinary, a gift that transcended training, a talent that defied explanation. As the last note faded, a stunned silence hung in the air, broken only by the soft sobs coming from somewhere in the back of the room. Then, slowly, tentatively, applause began to ripple through the room, growing in intensity until it became a thunderous ovation, a wave of appreciation that washed over Linda, cleansing her of the years of silent yearning, of unspoken dreams, of hidden fears. In that moment, she wasn't just Linda Stewart, the poor girl from the wrong side of town. She was Linda Stewart, the girl who spoke the universal language of music. As the applause subsided, Mr. Harrison stepped forward, his eyes shining with an almost paternal pride. "Linda," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "I would like to offer you a full scholarship to our youth orchestra program." And, he added, his smile widening, "I would be honored to give you violin lessons." The afternoon sun cast long, hazy shadows across the music room, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. A hush fell over the room as Mr. Harrison, beaming, gestured towards the lone violin resting on a stand center stage. Linda felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. Her worn shoes scuffed against the polished wooden floor as she hesitantly made her way forward. Each step felt like an eternity, amplifying the whispers and giggles that seemed to prick at her like needles. "I'd like to try," she had mumbled just moments ago, a response that surprised even herself. Now, standing before the expectant faces of her classmates, Linda wished she could disappear. What was I thinking? She berated herself internally. I'm going to make a fool of myself. The violin, gleaming under the stage lights, suddenly seemed like an insurmountable obstacle, a symbol of everything that separated her from the Jessica Morrisons and Tommy Richardses of the world, their effortless confidence, their expensive clothes, their casual air of belonging. Linda's threadbare dress, a hand-me-down from a neighbor, suddenly felt like a heavy weight, dragging her down. Jessica Morrison, her perfectly coiffed blonde hair shimmering, leaned towards Tommy Richards and snickered. "Beginner's luck," she whispered, loud enough for Linda to hear. Tommy, ever the sycophant, chuckled in response. "Yeah, she's going to sound like a dying cat." Linda's cheeks burned with shame. Their words echoed the anxieties that had plagued her for years, the constant awareness of her family's poverty, the gnawing feeling of being an outsider looking in. She gripped the neck of the violin, her knuckles turning white. Just get it over with, she told herself. Play something, anything, and then escape. Mr. Harrison, oblivious to the undercurrent of cruelty, smiled encouragingly. "Whenever you're ready, Linda." His kind eyes held a flicker of anticipation that sent a shiver down Linda's spine. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to block out the judging stares, the whispers, the weight of expectation. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she saw her mother's tired face, etched with worry and love. She remembered the sacrifices her mother made, working double shifts at the diner, just to keep a roof over their heads. A sudden surge of determination coursed through her. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about proving something to herself, to her mother, to all those who dismissed her. "I won't let them see me break," she vowed silently. Taking a deep breath, Linda placed the violin beneath her chin, the smooth wood cool against her skin. Her fingers trembled as she positioned them on the strings. The silence in the room deepened, thick with anticipation. Then, with a hesitant stroke of the bow, the first note rang out, pure and clear, cutting through the tense atmosphere like a beacon. Surprise flickered across Jessica's face, her smirk fading. Tommy's laughter died in his throat. The initial shaky notes transformed into a melody, hesitant at first, then gaining strength and confidence with each passing phrase. Linda lost herself in the music. The anxieties, the whispers, the self-doubt all faded away as she poured her heart and soul into the instrument. The melody soared, weaving a tapestry of emotions: longing, hope, resilience. It was a language she understood, a world where she could finally express the feelings she kept locked away inside. The music filled the room, washing over the stunned faces of her classmates. Tears welled up in Mrs. Patterson's eyes, a mixture of pride and relief. Even Mr. Harrison, a seasoned musician, seemed captivated, his expression shifting from encouragement to awe. As the last note faded into silence, a profound stillness settled over the room. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. The spell was broken by a soft sob from the back of the room. Then another, and another, until the silence was replaced by a wave of emotion. Tears streamed down Jessica's face, not tears of mockery, but of genuine emotion. Tommy stared at Linda, his jaw slack, a flicker of something akin to respect in his eyes. Linda lowered the violin, her heart pounding in her chest. The knot in her stomach had dissolved, replaced by a lightness she had never experienced before. The world seemed different, brighter, as if a veil had been lifted. Mr. Harrison, his eyes shining, stepped forward and gently took her hand. "Linda," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "that was extraordinary. I've never heard anything like it." He paused, searching for the right words. "I would be honored to offer you a full scholarship for music lessons and a place in the youth orchestra." Linda stared at him, speechless, her mind struggling to comprehend the magnitude of his words. A wave of warmth spread through her, a feeling of validation so intense it brought tears to her own eyes. In that moment, the little girl from the wrong side of the tracks, the girl who had always felt invisible, finally felt seen. The last note faded, a fragile whisper lost in the sudden, heavy silence. The bow trembled in Linda's small hand, her fingers slick with a nervous sweat she hadn't even realized she'd produced. Her heart thrummed a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a trapped bird desperate for release. The music room, moments ago filled with the hesitant strains of her violin, now held its breath. Linda's gaze remained fixed on the worn wooden floorboards, a dizzying array of scratches and scuffs mirroring the chaotic landscape of her own anxious thoughts. "They're all staring," she thought, the certainty pressing down on her like a physical weight. "They're all laughing." She could practically feel Jessica Morrison's sharp, disdainful gaze boring into her, Tommy Richards' snickers echoing in the suffocating quiet. Shame coiled in her stomach, a bitter, familiar taste. Then a single pair of hands began to clap, hesitant, tentative, like the first fragile buds of spring pushing through frozen earth. Then another, and another, until the room erupted in a wave of applause, a roaring crescendo that crashed over Linda, leaving her breathless and disoriented. Confusion warred with disbelief, a kaleidoscope of emotions swirling within her. Had she imagined the whole thing? Had the music transported her to some alternate reality where her clumsy attempt at playing wasn't a source of ridicule, but of admiration? Mrs. Patterson, her kind face etched with a mixture of surprise and something that looked suspiciously like pride, smiled warmly. "Linda," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Oh, sweetheart, that was magnificent." Linda blinked, the words filtering through the fog of her confusion. Did I do okay?" she whispered, the question barely audible above the lingering applause. Her voice trembled, reflecting the tremor that still ran through her small frame. She couldn't quite grasp what was happening. The expected jeers, the cruel laughter, none of it had materialized. Instead, she was met with this. Mr. Harrison, the high school orchestra director, approached her, his eyes shining with an intensity that both intimidated and intrigued her. He knelt beside her, his gaze meeting hers with a gentle firmness that belied the excitement radiating from him. "Linda," he began, his voice hushed with awe, "I have to ask, are you absolutely certain you've never played violin before?" Linda shook her head, her throat too tight to speak. The question echoed the doubts that had plagued her for weeks, the nagging fear that she was somehow deluding herself, that the music she heard in her head was nothing more than a childish fantasy. The violin, borrowed from the school's Lost and Found, had felt so familiar in her hands, an extension of her very being. Yet, she'd never had a lesson, never even touched the instrument before. Mr. Harrison's smile widened, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Sometimes, young man, we encounter what we call a natural gift," he said, his voice taking on a reverent tone. He looked at the worn violin in her hands, then back at her. "It's as if the music itself chose you, Linda. It flows through you, pure and untainted." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the captivated audience. "Talent doesn't care about the size of your house or the brand of your clothes." He placed a hand on her shoulder, a warm, reassuring weight. "It simply is." Linda's eyes stung with unshed tears. His words resonated deep within her, striking a chord that vibrated with a truth she hadn't dared to acknowledge, even to herself. It was a truth that transcended the worn hand-me-down she wore, the leaky roof of her tiny apartment, the constant worry etched on her mother's face. It was a truth that whispered of possibilities, of a future beyond the confines of her limited world. A lump formed in Carol's throat as she watched her daughter from the back of the room. She had worked double shifts at the diner to buy Linda a simple dress for the performance, a small extravagance that had stretched their already thin budget to its breaking point. The anxieties that had plagued her for weeks, the fear of Linda being mocked, the shame of their poverty being exposed, now seemed insignificant, dwarfed by the enormity of what she was witnessing. She saw not just her daughter playing the violin, but a glimpse of a future she hadn't dared to dream of. A future where Linda's talent, her gift, could lift them both out of the shadows and into the light. Mr. Harrison continued, his voice now ringing with an infectious enthusiasm. "Linda," he said, "I want to offer you a full scholarship to our youth orchestra program. We'll provide you with an instrument, lessons, everything you need to nurture this incredible gift." Linda's breath hitched. "A scholarship? Lessons?" The words were like a melody, weaving a tapestry of hope and wonder in her young mind. She looked at her mother, her eyes wide with disbelief. Carol nodded, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears. A silent exchange passed between them, a shared understanding of the profound shift that had just occurred. The world, moments ago a bleak and unforgiving landscape, now shimmered with the promise of a brighter future. The music had opened a door, and Linda, with trembling hands and a heart full of trepidation and hope, stepped through. The chipped porcelain sink, stained the color of weak tea, reflected Linda's hesitant face. A single bare bulb cast a harsh light across the cramped kitchen, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Her fingers, still faintly vibrating with the ghost of the violin strings, traced the worn formica countertop. "Mama, something happened today," she began, the words catching in her throat, tasting of both trepidation and a strange, burgeoning hope. The scent of overcooked cabbage clung to the air, a familiar comfort in the cramped apartment, a constant reminder of their meager existence. Carol Stewart, her back aching from a double shift at the diner, turned from the stove. Lines of weariness etched her face, but her eyes, the same shade of gray as the approaching twilight, held a warmth that always eased Linda's anxieties. "What is it, sweetheart?" Her voice was gentle, tinged with the exhaustion that had become a permanent fixture in their lives. She wiped her hands on her apron, a faded floral pattern against the worn denim. Linda hesitated. The memory of the afternoon, the hushed auditorium, the unexpected cascade of music that had poured from her, felt like a dream. A dangerous, fragile dream. I played a violin today in front of the whole class, she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. The fear of ridicule, the ingrained shame of their poverty, threatened to choke the words before they could fully escape. She braced herself for the familiar sting of disappointment, the unspoken reminder of their limited circumstances. What if Mama is angry? What if she thinks I was showing off? The thought twisted in her gut, a cold knot of anxiety. Carol's expression softened, a flicker of surprise in her weary eyes. A violin, Linda? Where did you? The unspoken question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their financial realities. Music lessons were a luxury they couldn't afford, a world beyond their reach. The reality of their situation pressed down on Carol, a constant, suffocating pressure. How can I explain this to her? How can I justify something so frivolous? She thought, her heart clenching with a familiar pang of guilt. She wanted to nurture Linda's spark, but the harsh realities of their life always loomed, a dark cloud threatening to extinguish any flicker of hope. Before Linda could stammer out a reply, a knock echoed through the thin apartment door. Both mother and daughter turned, their faces etched with a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. Who would visit them at this hour? The unexpected interruption sent a ripple of unease through Linda. Is it someone from school? Did they come to tell Mama what really happened? Her heart pounded against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Carol smoothed down her apron, her hand trembling slightly as she opened the door. Standing on their doorstep, holding a worn leather briefcase, was Mr. Harrison, the high school orchestra director. His kind face, usually radiating enthusiasm, held a mixture of gravity and something else, hope. He offered a hesitant smile. Mrs. Stewart? Linda. His voice was soft, respectful. He glanced at Linda, a flicker of recognition in his eyes, a silent acknowledgement of the shared experience that hung heavy in the air between them. Mr. Harrison? Carol's voice was tinged with confusion. What would he possibly want? The question echoed in her mind, a dissonant chord against the backdrop of their quiet evening. I'm sorry to intrude so late, Mr. Harrison began, his gaze shifting between mother and daughter. But I needed to speak with you both.